There is a particular kind of morning that arrives without warning, the phone call that changes everything, and the diagnosis spoken in a voice trying to sound gentle, the marriage that quietly ends after years of trying, the job that disappears after decades of loyalty. In that first moment, the ground beneath you does not simply shift, it seems to disappear entirely, and you are left standing in a space where nothing feels solid anymore. Your hands may shake without your permission. Your mind may race through 100 possibilities at once, none of them comforting. And somewhere underneath the panic, a quieter, more painful question begins to surface. One you may not have said out loud, even to yourself. How is anyone supposed to stay steady when the very foundation of their life has just been taken away? Perhaps you remember exactly where you were standing the last time this happened to you. The particular quality of light in the room. The strange, almost irrelevant detail your mind fixated on, the sound of a clock, the pattern on a tablecloth, while the actual news was still settling into your body. Time behaves strangely in these moments, both frozen and rushing forward at once. And afterward, people often describe feeling as though they were watching themselves from a slight distance, present and absent simultaneously. This is not weakness, it is simply what it feels like to be a human being confronted suddenly with something too large to process all at once. You have likely faced a version of this moment already, perhaps more than once across the years. And if you have not yet, some version of it is likely still ahead of you, because this is simply what it means to be alive long enough to accumulate a real life, full of people you love, and plans you have made, and things you cannot control no matter how carefully you have lived. What you have probably noticed, in the aftermath of your own hardest moments, is that some people seem to shatter completely under this kind of weight, while others, facing losses just as devastating, somehow remain upright, present, even quietly steady in ways that seem almost impossible to understand from the outside. This is not because they feel less. It is because something in how they relate to the falling apart itself is fundamentally different. You may have known someone like this, perhaps a parent, a grandparent, a mentor, someone who faced genuine devastation, the loss of a spouse, a sudden illness, the collapse of a business built over decades, and yet somehow continued to show up for the people around them with a kind of quiet dignity that seemed almost otherworldly. At the time, you may have assumed this was simply their temperament, something they were born with, rather than something they built. But steadiness of this kind is rarely inherited whole. It is far more often assembled slowly, often invisibly, through years of small internal choices that nobody else was there to witness. Most people carry a quiet, unexamined belief that peace of mind depends on life going according to plan. They believe, often without ever stating it directly, that calm is something you are entitled to when things are going well, and something that naturally disappears the moment things go wrong. Under this belief, every hardship becomes not only painful in itself, but also a personal failure, evidence that you were not strong enough, prepared enough, or resilient enough to remain steady. This double burden, the pain of the event itself layered beneath the shame of not handling it perfectly, is what quietly exhausts so many people over the course of a lifetime, long after any single crisis has technically passed. They survive the event itself, and then spend years quietly punishing themselves for how they survived it. This hidden belief shapes far more of daily life than most people realize. It shows up in the low hum of anxiety that lives beneath ordinary days, the sense that disaster could be one phone call away and that you would not know how to survive it if it came. It shows up in relationships, where the fear of loss makes people cling too tightly or withdraw too completely, unable to simply be present because some part of the mind is always bracing for the next collapse. It shows up in the exhausting effort so many people put into controlling circumstances that were never fully controllable in the first place. Careers, other people's opinions, the unpredictable turns of health and fortune, chasing a sense of security that circumstances alone can never actually provide. Confidence quietly erodes under this weight because a person who does not trust their own capacity to meet hardship will always feel slightly unsafe, no matter how comfortable their circumstances currently appear. There is also a subtler cost, one that rarely gets named directly. Many people, having lived through one significant collapse, spend years afterward quietly bracing for the next one, treating every quiet season of life as merely the calm before an inevitable storm, rather than as something to be inhabited fully in its own right. This constant low-level bracing steals a great deal from ordinary happiness, because a mind occupied with guarding against future catastrophe has very little spare capacity left for court. genuinely enjoying the present moment, even when that present moment happens to be a good one. The central insight that changes this entire arrangement is both ancient and remarkably simple, though it takes most people years to genuinely absorb it. Your peace does not have to depend on your circumstances. It can depend instead on where you place your attention and effort, specifically on the difference between what is actually within your control and what has never been within your control at all, no matter how much you have tried to manage it. Circumstances, other people's choices, illness, timing, the unpredictable turns of fortune, these were never truly yours to command. What has always belonged to you, in every single moment of your life, including the very worst ones, is your judgment about what is happening, your choice of how to respond, and the character you bring into the room, regardless of what the room contains. This distinction, once it is genuinely understood rather than simply repeated as a phrase, becomes the foundation from which real steadiness can grow, even when everything else is falling apart around it. This idea did not begin in a self-help book or a modern seminar. It began, in its clearest form, with a man named Epictetus, who was born into slavery in the ancient world and later became one of the most influential philosophers of his era. Having lived through genuine powerlessness over his own body and circumstances for years, he was uniquely positioned to explore a question most people only consider in the abstract. What remains yours, even when nearly everything else has been taken away? His teaching centered on a clear division between what lies within a person's power, namely their own judgments, intentions, and responses, and what lies outside it, namely nearly everything else, including reputation, health, and the actions of other people. He taught that suffering multiplies dramatically when a person mistakes something outside their control for something within it, spending enormous energy trying to command what was never theirs to command in the first place, while neglecting the one area where real power always remained available. What makes his teaching so striking is not simply the idea itself, but the fact that it was formed by someone who genuinely had almost nothing else, and still found, within that near-total deprivation, a domain that remained entirely his own. Marcus Aurelius, an emperor who inherited Epictetus's ideas and carried them through years of war, plague, and political betrayal, applied this same framework to an extraordinarily difficult life. He wrote privately, not for publication, reminding himself again and again that events themselves carry no inherent verdict, that it is the mind's judgment about an event which determines whether it is experienced as catastrophe or simply as circumstance, to be met with clear thinking. He was not naive about suffering. He buried children. He led armies through devastating illness. He governed an empire that was, for much of his reign, under genuine existential threat. But his private writings suggest a man who had trained himself, through years of deliberate practice rather than natural temperament, to meet each difficulty by first asking what within this moment is actually mine to influence, and to direct his full attention there rather than toward the parts of the situation that remained beyond his reach. It is worth remembering that these were not polished statements crafted for an audience. They were private reminders a tired, grieving man wrote to himself, evidence that this steadiness was something he had to continually rebuild, rather than something he simply possessed by nature. In the 20th century, a psychologist and neurologist named Viktor Frankl explored a strikingly similar territory from an entirely different starting point. Having survived years in Nazi concentration camps where nearly every external freedom had been stripped away, out of that experience, he developed the conviction that even in circumstances of extreme suffering, a final human freedom remained available, the freedom to choose one's attitude in any given set of circumstances, and to find meaning even within suffering that could not be avoided or escaped. His observations, developed later into a form of psychological practice, suggested that people who could locate some thread of meaning within their hardship, whatever that meaning happened to be for them personally, whether it was devotion to loved ones, a sense of purpose, or simply the determination to bear witness to what had happened, tended to endure that hardship with a resilience that those without any sense of meaning simply could not access in the same way. His work suggests that meaning is not something life hands a person automatically during hardship, but something a person must actively search for and construct, even amid circumstances that offer very little else to hold on to. Buddhist teaching approaches the same fundamental territory through the concept of impermanence, the observation that all conditions, all circumstances, all relationships and states of being are inherently temporary, constantly arising and passing away, regardless of how tightly a person tries to hold on to them. Suffering, in this framework, often intensifies not simply because of loss itself, but because of the resistance to accepting that loss was always a possibility built into the nature of anything that exists in time. This is not a teaching of detachment from love or care. It is an invitation to hold what you love fully, while also recognizing its impermanent nature. One, honestly, which paradoxically tends to deepen appreciation for what is present rather than mass diminishing it, while also softening the particular kind of shock that arrives when impermanent things eventually change, as they always eventually do. A person who has genuinely absorbed this teaching does not love less because they understand impermanence. If anything, they tend to love more attentively, precisely because they no longer take the presence of what they love for granted. Taken together, these four perspectives, an enslaved philosopher, an emperor, a survivor of the concentration camps, and a contemplative tradition spanning thousands of years, converge on a remarkably consistent conclusion, despite their vastly different origins. Steadiness does not come from controlling circumstances, which was never fully possible to begin with, but from where a person chooses to place attention, judgment, and meaning within whatever circumstances actually arrive. Understanding the psychology behind why some people crumble and others remain steady requires looking closely at what the mind actually does in moments of crisis. When life falls apart suddenly, the mind's first instinct is often to search desperately for control, replaying the event repeatedly, searching for what could have prevented it, what should have been done differently, as though enough mental effort might somehow rewrite what has already happened. This searching feels productive in the moment, but it frequently traps a person in a loop that offers no resolution, only exhaustion, because the mind is attempting to exert control over something that has already passed beyond the reach of control entirely. Recognizing this pattern as it happens, rather than being swept along by it unknowingly, is often the first genuine step toward regaining some sense of steadiness. There is also a natural tendency, deeply wired into how the mind processes threat, to imagine the worst possible continuation of any difficult situation, projecting catastrophe far beyond what the current moment actually contains. This is not a personal weakness. It reflects how the mind has evolved to prepare for danger by anticipating it broadly rather than narrowly. But in the modern context of emotional crisis, this same mechanism often causes a person to suffer not only the actual difficulty in front of them, but dozens of imagined future difficulties that may never actually arrive, multiplying pain far beyond what any single moment requires a person to carry. Learning to notice when the mind has drifted from the actual present circumstance into an imagined future one is a skill that, once developed, considerably lightens the load of any genuine hardship. It does not mean refusing to plan sensibly for real possibilities. It means noticing the difference between practical planning and the endless, when exhausting rehearsal of disasters that have not yet happened and may never happen at all. This tendency toward catastrophic projection is often reinforced by isolation. When difficult news arrives late at night, or during a stretch of hours when there is no one to talk it through with, the mind is left alone with its own worst imaginings, and without another voice to interrupt the spiral. Those imaginings can feel far more certain and far more final than they actually are. This is one reason reaching out to another person during a genuine crisis, even briefly, even just to say the situation out loud to someone who cares, so often provides relief that seems disproportionate to the simple act of speaking. Another person's presence tends to slow the mind's rush toward worst-case conclusions, simply by introducing a second perspective into a process that was, until that point, running entirely unchecked inside a single mind. Here is a small practice you can begin the very next time you feel life tilting beneath you, one requiring no special preparation beyond a willingness to pause. When a difficult situation arises, take a moment to silently and honestly separate it into two categories. First, name specifically what is genuinely outside your control in this situation: the diagnosis itself, the other person's decision, the outcome that has already occurred. Then name specifically what remains within your control even now: your next action, your tone of voice, how you choose to spend the coming hour, whether you reach out for support or withdraw into isolation. This works because it interrupts the mind's instinct to treat the entire situation as a single overwhelming mass, and instead divides it into a portion that can be released, since holding on to it accomplishes nothing, and a portion that can be actively engaged, since this is where your genuine influence still lives. Even naming this division out loud, in just a sentence or two, tends to lower the immediate, intensity of panic simply by giving the mind somewhere useful to direct itself. Over time, this small act of sorting becomes almost automatic, a reflex you can reach for even in the earliest, most disorienting moments of a crisis. Beyond this in-the-moment practice, a nightly ritual can help build this capacity steadily over time, so that it becomes more available precisely when a genuine crisis eventually arrives. Each evening, spend a few quiet minutes reviewing the day, not searching for what went wrong, but specifically noticing any moment when you felt your peace depended on something outside your control, whether that was another person's mood, an uncertain outcome at work, or simply the unpredictable events of an ordinary day. Ask yourself what you were actually able to influence in that moment, separate from what you were not. Ask yourself whether any energy spent worrying about the uncontrollable portion actually changed anything about it. Ask yourself what it might have felt like to direct that same energy entirely toward the portion you could influence instead. And ask yourself, gently, what you are currently holding on to too tightly, some outcome, some person's approval, some plan for the future that might benefit from being held with slightly more openness. This is not an exercise in detachment from life. It is an exercise in placing your energy where it can actually do something, rather than where it can only exhaust you. The hidden root cause beneath the struggle to stay calm when life falls apart is rarely the hardship itself, however severe that hardship may genuinely be. Far more often, it is an old, largely unconscious belief that safety depends entirely on circumstances remaining stable, a belief usually formed early, sometimes in childhood environments where genuine unpredictability made a person feel that vigilance and control were the only available protections against harm. A person raised in an unstable household often carries into adulthood an exaggerated need to control outcomes that were never controllable to begin with, not because they lack wisdom, but because an earlier version of themselves learned, quite reasonably given the circumstances, that letting go felt dangerous. This connects directly back to the central insight explored earlier, because the entire discipline of distinguishing what is yours to control from what is not becomes considerably more difficult for someone whose nervous system has learned, through real experience, that losing control once meant real danger. Recognizing this origin, without judgment, is often what finally allows a person to begin loosening a grip that has quietly exhausted them for years. A grip that made complete sense for the child who first developed it, even though it no longer serves the adult who still carries it. A common misconception deserves direct attention here, because it prevents many people from pursuing this kind of steadiness at all. Staying calm when life falls apart does not mean suppressing grief, minimizing loss, or pretending that pain does not exist. It is not a performance of composure, covering over feelings that are never actually allowed expression. Genuine Stoic calm, properly understood, has never meant the absence of feeling. It means feeling fully, while still maintaining a clear enough mind to choose how to act within that feeling, rather than being entirely governed by it. A person who has cultivated this kind of steadiness can still weep over genuine loss, can still feel the full weight of fear or grief moving through them, while also remaining capable of making sound decisions, caring for the people who depend on them, and continuing to function with dignity even while the feeling itself has not yet passed. This distinction matters enormously, because many people avoid this entire path out of a fear that becoming steadier means becoming distant from their own humanity, when in truth, the opposite tends to be the case. A person who trusts their own capacity to meet hardship rather than fearing it is generally more available to feel deeply, not less, because so much less energy is spent bracing against the possibility of falling apart entirely. The body plays a far more significant role in this capacity for steadiness than most people initially assume. In moments of acute crisis, the breath tends to become shallow and rapid, and the body enters a state that reinforces the mind's sense of emergency, making clear thought considerably more difficult to access. Deliberately slowing the breath, particularly lengthening the exhale, sends the nervous system a different signal, one associated with safety rather than continued threat, creating physical conditions in which clearer thinking becomes more available even amid genuine difficulty. A short walk, taken specifically during moments of overwhelm rather than only as a general habit, can help discharge some of the physical intensity that crisis generates, giving the mind a slightly steadier platform from which to think. Consistent, adequate sleep, protected as carefully as possible even during difficult seasons of life, similarly supports the kind of clear judgment that this entire practice depends upon, since an exhausted mind reliably struggles far more to distinguish what is controllable from what is not. Simple daily structure, keeping regular meal times, stepping outside briefly each day, maintaining some small routine, even amid upheaval, can also provide the body with a sense of stability that the surrounding circumstances currently lack. There is something quietly steadying about a body that eats at roughly the same hours, moves a little each day, and rests when rest is needed, even while the surrounding circumstances remain genuinely chaotic. The routine itself becomes a kind of anchor, a small, predictable rhythm that the rest of the day can be built around, even when almost everything else feels uncertain. None of this eliminates hardship. It simply creates slightly more favorable internal conditions from which to meet it. When these threads are drawn together, a complete and coherent way of meeting life's hardest moments begins to take shape. First, you recognize that your peace does not have to depend entirely on your circumstances, but can instead depend on where you direct your attention and effort. A distinction articulated clearly by a philosopher who understood powerlessness firsthand and carried forward by an emperor who lived through genuine catastrophe without losing his footing. Then, you learn to divide any difficult moment honestly into what lies within your influence and what does not, directing your energy specifically toward the portion that can actually be shaped by your choices. Next, you build this capacity steadily through honest nightly reflection, gradually loosening an old, protective grip that once made sense but no longer serves you as well as it once did. Finally, you support this entire practice through the body itself, through breath, movement, and rest, and simple daily structure, creating the physical conditions in which clear judgment remains available even under genuine pressure. None of these steps promise that hardship will stop arriving, because hardship is simply part of what it means to live a full human life. What they offer instead is a way of meeting that hardship without being entirely dismantled by it each time it appears. Nothing about this transforms a person overnight, and no single video or evening of reflection will make you immune to the genuine pain of loss, uncertainty, or fear. That was never truly the goal. The goal is something quieter and more durable, the gradual development of a steadiness that, does not depend on life cooperating with your plans, a steadiness available even, especially, on the days when nothing goes according to plan at all. Tonight, before this day closes, try simply naming one thing currently weighing on you, and honestly sorting it into what you can influence and what you cannot, releasing your grip on the second portion just slightly, even if only for a few minutes. Tomorrow, when some new difficulty inevitably arrives, as it will for every person eventually, you will already be carrying a small amount more capacity to meet it than you did yesterday. And across seasons and years, through nothing more dramatic than this quiet, repeated practice, you may find yourself becoming the kind of person who remains standing, however shaken, exactly when it matters most, not because life became easier, but because you became steadier in meeting it. If tonight's reflection gave you something worth carrying forward, there is another video waiting that explores this same territory of steadiness and clarity from a different angle, one that may meet you exactly where you are right now. Consider subscribing if these ideas feel worth returning to on other difficult evenings. And before you close this one, take a slow breath and let yourself trust, just slightly more than before, in your own capacity to meet whatever comes next.